everybody again, and welcome to Business-Wise Insiders for February. In a moment, I'll start the presentation, and as I said, given the large number of attendees, I'm just going to keep everybody on mute for the duration of the presentation to ensure we can move through the material smoothly and efficiently. The presentation will run for about 20 or 25 minutes, and at that point, we'll divide the group into smaller breakout rooms where you'll be free from the shackles of my mute button, and you can introduce yourselves to some of your peers and talk a little bit more about today's topic or any other business development challenge or priority that's on your mind. If you do have a question during the presentation, you can ask it in the chat window, or you can just save them for the breakout rooms. We'll have some of our wise guys in each room. Happy to talk through any of it with you. And then finally, during the presentation, I'll put a couple of questions to the group using Zoom's polling feature. It's anonymous and obviously no pressure to answer, but it's always enlightening to get a sense of everybody's thoughts about some of the questions we'll be covering. And it's something we may touch on later in the breakout sessions. So with that, let's turn to today's topic. We'll be talking about sales action triggers, specifically 6 proven psychological concepts that can make the difference in successfully getting your prospect to act. And I realize the word act is sort of a nebulous term, so I wanted to first talk a little more about what I mean by that. It may be easier to think about prospect action in terms of a yes, and an affirmative decision to take a certain step along the path towards sales relationship. And seeing a yes as a step along a path is important. It's not just a yes, I want to buy your product or service, although that's obviously the desired outcome. But the yeses at the beginning of the process are really important too, especially as you work toward that first appointment. So ask yourself, what makes your prospect decide to say yes, to take your call, click on your email, agree to your meeting, or ultimately to buy your products? And while we might like to think of ourselves as completely rational people who consider all relevant information and perform a rigorous cost-benefit calculation to guide decisions, the reality is we're not. We don't have the time or bandwidth. So instead, our brains use mental shortcuts to help us make decisions faster. And you may have heard of Dr. Robert Cialdini's famous book, Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion. Our longtime insiders will likely recognize it because we touch on it and its principles often. Dr. Cialdini is a professor of marketing and psychology, and his book is based on that premise that people use mental shortcuts to help them make decisions faster. And Dr. Cialdini, in his book, identified 6 principles of persuasion, laying out specific triggers that activate those mental shortcuts. We're going to talk a little about each one today and provide some specific examples of prospecting strategies that make use of them. But before I start, I wanted to make one really important point, and that's that you shouldn't think of these action triggers as gimmicks that you use to trick a prospect into taking a meeting with you. They're strategies for clarifying your value, and they succeed by nudging a prospect who's sitting on the fence and who may not yet realize that they can benefit from engaging with you toward action. So before I dive in, Deb, did you want to say anything?
Sorry. One of the things that I like to think about is when we think about this prospecting sales funnel, a Dr. Flint McLaughlin, who's from a company called McLabs and does a lot of research on marketing and sales, turns this concept of the funnel upside down. And when we think of the prospecting mountain, or the way our prospects get to yes, there's many different paths to the mountain, and gravity is pulling us or pulling our prospects back down all the time. But if we think about some of the things Sam's going to be discussing today, we're going to think about all of the different paths and the opportunities to get those multiple yeses so that we can get to that ultimate hole in the center of the funnel or get to the top of the mountain. And I think it's a great image to think about when we're faced with no's, pick ourselves up, keep getting up there to get to the top.
Right, thanks, Deb. So our first action trigger is based on the concept of reciprocity. And that concept holds that people feel obliged to give back to others what they've received. So in this example, the woman on the left offers to pay for lunch, and the man on the right immediately thinks of returning the favor. So even if the man would never have thought of paying for lunch on his own, the offer from the woman triggers that internal obligation. And reciprocity can work in really interesting and subtle ways. One study showed that restaurant customers tip more when their waiter brings a small gift like chocolates along with a check at the end of the meal. And the tip is even higher when the waiter stops, turns around, and gives another treat because the customer happened to be so good. That unexpected personal gift can really trigger the obligation to give something back. And you can probably think of how reciprocity works in prospecting and marketing. One obvious example is giving away free stuff, free samples, free trials, and rewards make prospects want to give back. Referrals, referring business to your colleagues can help generate reciprocal referrals and get business back to you. And then free knowledge, paying you back for free advice and ideas. And one specific example of reciprocity that we've covered in previous insider sessions might be to email your prospect with something that they might find valuable, like an article or a set of tips, before you cold call them. And then they may be more likely to take your call when you do pick up the phone. And really more important than thinking of the individual free things you might give away is to think of your mindset as a sales rep and to try to be a giver by always focusing on what is the best fit and outcome for your prospect, rather than how you can eventually sell your product or service. And just to close this section with a couple of key takeaways, reciprocity works partly because returning the favor is a nice thing to do, but also because people are uncomfortable with the feeling of being indebted to somebody. We feel compelled to even out the ledger. The order of the offer also matters. If you ask for something directly in exchange for whatever it is you're giving, it doesn't work as well because it feels like a transaction. So instead, giving something first, no strings attached, and then making a request is how to capitalize on the power of reciprocity. And then again, finally, reciprocity is especially powerful when the gift is unexpected and personal. Those kinds of gifts resonate especially well with somebody and create a strong drive to return that favor. Deborah, did you have anything you wanted to add on reciprocity?
I love the example of the restaurant server and the mints, because if we think about it logically, and if somebody said, would you give a bigger tip if somebody gave you a chocolate or a mint at the end of the meal? My rational brain says, no, it would depend on the quality of the food and the service in the restaurant and all of those things. And yet we can't, part of our brains work in mysterious ways. And these scientific tests prove the difference in the tips. So I think this reciprocity stuff, while we're analyzing it, if we can use it as we're developing new business, it can have a lot of power.
Right, and these triggers are listed in no particular order. I think they may be the order that Dr. Cialdini listed them in his book, but I'll talk at the end about sort of a broad overview of how they all work together and which we think are most important as you work to set those critical first appointments. So the second trigger is commitment and consistency. And the idea here is that people like to be consistent with the things that they've previously said or done. So here the man on the left is asking for two things. First, he asks the woman to sign his petition. It's a small request, so she says yes. And then he asks for a donation to the same cause. And here's where the action trigger comes in. Since she's already expressed her support for the cause by signing the petition, she feels more compelled to follow through on that support by giving money. And here's a real world example. People were asked to put a small sticker in their window to show their support for a safe driving campaign. And some agreed and some declined, but when the same group was later asked to put a larger yard sign expressing support for the same cause to people who had already agreed to the window sticker, the smaller requests were more likely to say yes to that larger request and put up a yard sign. And one example that shows the power of commitment and consistency in cold calling is the 369 question. This is sort of a lighthearted way to keep the conversation going or secure an agreement for you to follow up at a later date when your prospect resists setting an appointment on a cold call. So when your prospect resists saying, I understand you don't want to meet right now, let me ask you 3, 6, or 9, they'll inevitably say, what do you mean? Or I don't understand. And then you clarify by saying, when should I follow up? In 3, 6, or 9. And then having your prospect verbalize the time frame, 3 days, 6 weeks, 9 months, they'll be more likely to follow through on it and then take your call at that time. The key points here are that people believe themselves more than they believe other people. They're more likely to follow through on something that they've said than something someone else asks them or tells them to do. And again, the order is important. Asking for a small commitment first and a big commitment later is more likely to produce the desired outcome. And finally, commitments that are voluntary, active, and public create the strongest motivation for follow-through. So if you think about a customer testimonial on your homepage, that customer, because they've verbalized support for your product or service and publicized it by putting it on your website, is more likely to stay a customer because of those things. Deb, did you want to add anything here?
Well, I love asking somebody 3, 6, or 9. If you prefer to be to just ask, when should I follow up? I want to remind everybody to not put in the time limit. Instead of saying, should I follow up in 2 weeks or next year? Let the prospect put in the timetable. It'll be better than you might expect.
Right, good point. All right, so moving on to our third trigger, we're going to look at the principle of social proof, which is probably the most well-known and intuitive of Cialdini's 6 triggers. Social proof is based on the premise that people look to the actions of others as a guide, especially when they're uncertain about what to do. So here you have the man on the left saying, I love this product. Everyone I know loves it too. And the man on the right says, I wasn't sure about it, but it sounds like most people really like it, so I'll buy it too. And this is a really interesting example of social proof in action. The reason it's so powerful is that it's about more than just receiving assurances that come with someone else's experience. It's also about the drive to be part of something bigger, to be part of a team, to avoid missing out. And in this example, one study showed that people are more likely to reuse hotel towels when there's a note indicating that the majority of other guests do so as well. So you can see the note from the management saying 75% of guests who stay in this room reuse their towels. People are more likely to reuse them when they see that note. And some obvious examples of social proof, as I mentioned in the last section, are testimonials from current clients or case studies that show how you've helped clients in the past. But one concrete example we look to is something we call the boomerang message. And this is a voicemail strategy that mentions a client company that's a competitor of the prospect you're trying to reach. So you can see I'm calling regarding competitor company who's your client. Please get back to me at phone number. The idea here is to pique your prospect's interest by mentioning another company who they know and who's in a similar situation. And that potential social proof can be really powerful at generating a callback. And some key points here. So the fear of missing out can be really powerful in a business context where people worry about being at a disadvantage to their competitors. If every company in an industry uses a certain product or service, the pressure to do the same can be heavy. There's also safety in numbers. If others are doing it, there's less perceived risk. So when you're making that calculation about whether to take a step, knowing that there may be less risk involved can help you take that step forward. And then again, the more specific the social proof is, the more powerful it is. So guests who stay in this room got people to reuse towels more than guests who stay in this hotel. And the same idea is at work in the boomerang message because it ties social proof to a specific competitor in your industry. Deborah, anything from you?
Certainly, all of us prefer making a call when we have a referral. John Doe said that I should give you a call. And just doing that is a form of this method of persuasion.
So our fourth trigger is likability and familiarity. And this one is based on the idea that people prefer to say yes to those they like and to whom they are similar. So here you have the man on the left mentioning a couple points of commonality between him and his prospect. We both went to the same school. We both love golf. She says we have a lot in common. I'd much rather do business with him than with a stranger. And for an example, one study found that students in a negotiation class were much more likely to reach agreement when they were instructed to get to know each other first rather than to reach a deal as quickly as possible. Which is really interesting. You think the drive to get it done quickly would produce results, but when they were told to go more slowly and get to know each other, they ended up developing that foundation that led to success. And this is a kind of a tough one because it's not easy to just conjure up a sense of familiarity with somebody if you don't know them. It can feel manufactured, but if you do have shared experiences with the prospect, it can really help to identify them so you can mention them when you interact with them. One easy way for BeWise subscribers to find those experiences is with our LinkedIn feature. We always recommend to clients that they use this on a company profile before they go in an appointment to see if they can uncover any mutual connections or other commonalities with prospects. And probably the most powerful aspect of likability and familiarity is similarity, feeling like you're in the same boat as the person you're engaging with. And in fact, Dr. Cialdini wrote a follow-up book to Influence called Persuasion, where he takes this concept one step further and creates a seventh action trigger he called unity. And unity says that people are especially persuaded by a sense of shared identity. So unity can be triggered by kinship or geography, family, and those we grew up with, by shared action and co-creation, people we work with, and long-term reciprocity, like long-time friends and relationships. And Deb made the point yesterday, I think it's a really good one, particularly importantly in the current environment, you can emphasize this sense of unity that comes from being part of the same local business community, which obviously most of our customers are. Many of us are working remotely now, which makes it easier to engage all over the country and world, but those local connections are still really important. And for those of us who sell to our local markets, that sense of unity can be really powerful. But likability and familiarity can work even if you don't know or have shared experiences with your prospect. Things like compliments and cooperation can have a similar effect. And the idea here is to make people feel like you're on the same side of a problem as they are and are working together to solve it rather than just a seller and a buyer on opposite sides of the table. Deb, did you want to add anything?
I'll just mention for those of you that are interested in taking a deeper dive in Cialdini's world, and his first book, or the concepts in his first book are in his second, the Persuasion book. So I recommend for those of you that want to save a lot of time, get the second book, get Persuasion. He summarizes the first 6 principles, and you'll save yourself some time and effort.
So moving on, fifth action trigger is authority. And authority is based on the fact that people follow the lead of credible, knowledgeable experts. So here you have the gentleman on the left saying he's been helping clients achieve X for over 30 years. I want you to benefit from my expertise. The person on the right recognizes that he knows what he's talking about. You should probably listen to him. In one really interesting example of authority, a study found that physical therapists get more patients to follow recommendations when they display their diploma on their office wall. And it just shows how subtle cues can really enforce certain impressions. And here are 3 common examples of how authority can be used in business: having experts that you can cite to increase your credibility with prospects, marketing to influencers who are seen as experts in their field and who can help spread the word to others. And then the third one here is especially important because it has less to do with marketing and really gets at the value you provide to your clients. It's becoming an expert for yourself, building knowledge, and sharing your expertise with your prospects. When you present yourself and are perceived as an authority, people will want to engage with you regardless of whether they ever become a client, which is critical to setting those first-time appointments. Deborah, anything on authority?
So the world of marketing is as broad and has many different aspects, like many other professions. When you think of physicians, etc., we generally want to go to a specialist when we have a serious problem. And I'd like it to take a moment to comment on my colleague, Sam Mitchell, who has an amazing expertise and talent in writing messages for email. And while there are many, many different aspects of marketing, when you're ready to do some either automated email prospecting or any kind of marketing with BeWise, Sam is your guy. He does an amazing job.
Thank you, Deb. And that actually illustrates a concept that I did not mention about authority, which is when somebody else vouches for you, it's more successful than when you vouch for yourself. So I appreciate it. And obviously happy to talk with anybody who's interested in what Deb described. So the final action trigger is scarcity. And the idea here is pretty simple. People want more of the things there are less of, and they're motivated to act when those things are scarce. The example here is a pretty common one. You have the businesswoman on the left saying, this is the last day we'll be offering our product at lower prices. And on the right, the woman feels an urgency to act quickly because that time is limited. One example here, not sure how many of you remember the Concorde. It's been a while since it was in service, but the day after British Airways announced that it would soon cancel its daily Concorde flights from London to Rome, sales went through the roof. And it shows that scarcity can operate in a couple of different ways. There's limited quantity. There's only one left, so you better act fast. You can have limited time to get that thing. Sale ends tomorrow, act now. Or, and perhaps most importantly, you may only be able to get something from one place. That's the uniqueness. And the first two represent good ways to motivate people in sort of a one-off basis, for example, with a limited time offer, but they're more tactical. The last one is really important because it gets at the heart of what differentiates you from your competitors. I bet everyone on this call thinks they provide their product or service better or in a different way than everybody else. And emphasizing that difference can activate the scarcity trigger. And that brings me to one final slide where I want to try to look at the big picture. Hopefully you've all gained some ideas today about how you can, how and why each of these 6 action triggers work and how you can use them in various sales and prospecting contexts to nudge an uncertain prospect toward acting on your call, email, or appointment request. But while they're all valuable in certain contexts, to us, 3 really stand out above the rest in terms of their universality and their importance to setting first-time appointments with new prospects. And those are reciprocity, authority, and scarcity. And that's because the other 3, likability, commitment, and social proof, really depend on someone or something else. A testimonial from a customer, a shared experience, or a commitment from your prospect. Whereas reciprocity, authority, and scarcity are all about you. You know something about your business or industry that your prospects don't. And you can always give that knowledge freely. And that's really the key to answering that critical question. What does my prospect get from a meeting with me, even if they never become a client? And if you can answer that question effectively, then your prospect really has no reason not to meet with you because there are no strings attached and they get something valuable from you that they can't get from anywhere else. So hopefully that's some food for thought for the breakout sessions, which will start in just a moment. And this poll. As I said, we'll have a couple of our own biz dev experts from Atlanta, Dallas, Fort Worth, and Charlotte in each room to help lead the discussion and answer any questions. And you'll be able to unmute yourself as soon as you enter the breakout room. But if you could please wait just a moment to let our wise guys introduce themselves and start the discussion, that would be great. And thanks again to everybody. We'll see you in the rooms.